Welcome to session 2 of our licensing lunch and learn. I'm glad to see some names of returning folks on a Friday, taking time to learn what you need so that you can start to practice studying for the exam in a way that is effective. That's really the whole purpose of our lunch and learn, is for you all to get all the tools that you need so that after the 10 weeks, you know what to study, what are effective study strategies, know where to go on our social work website to get additional resources, and hopefully all of those ingredients together get you to where you need to be in terms of passing your licensing exam. We, of course, had a good excellent first start. And we do have the video from Angela. We just need to do some editing on it and we will send it out. Our goal is to send out the recordings by the following Tuesday. Give or take something that may happen. But for the most part, you all will get the recordings and the PowerPoints of the presenters who are willing to share their PowerPoints before the following session, just in case you want to review what we talked about in preparation for the following week. But just know that after our 10-week series is done, you all will all be added to a Canvas or a little hub where all the videos will be housed, all the PowerPoints, all the additional resources, not only from our lunch and learn, but we've collected resources over the years from different presenters and talks that we've had about the licensing exam. So you're going to be given access to that space for as long as you need it. I also want to make sure that you all know that you're welcome to ask questions. If we don't know the answer, we can search and try to get those answers for you as it relates to the licensing exam. So that's it for housekeeping. I'm very excited that we have our guest speaker here, Dr. Zena Gould, who is another expert in our Study Skills Academy at Wayne State. So we're building upon what you all learned last week and getting you prepared for our second half of the Lunch and Learn, where we'll start to dive into the actual content of the exam. So get ready for another good session, Zena. Thank you so much for joining us, and I know that we're going to get some good tools from you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here. My name's Zena, and I work at the Study Skills Academy. I've been working with study skills for the past 10 years, so this is something, helping students with the learning process is something that I'm very passionate about. So I'm really excited to be here and talking with all of you. So please feel free to ask questions, and I'd like to make this more of a discussion. I know that you learned a lot of study techniques from Angela, and this is kind of a additional presentation to kind of go deeper into some topics. I do want to say that kind of some of my how I'm looking at this material today is from a counseling standpoint. So I, in the past few years, took the counseling licensing exam, and I know that that is different than the social work exam. But from some colleagues that I've spoken with, there is a lot of overlap. So I'm going to share some of my experience too with prepping for the counseling exam, since the fields are very closely related. So I'll be speaking as a learning specialist and also just kind of from my student perspective as well. So what are we going to talk about today? So some suggestions of what to talk about is creating a study schedule, some study tips, going a little bit deeper into that, and then some discussion / question and answer. But I'm very flexible with what we want to talk about today. So if there are certain things that you would like to focus on, I can definitely do that. So I'm going to be asking some questions, and feel free to, give your responses in the chat, or, go ahead and unmute yourself and talk. But the first question I have, and I'll put it in the chat, is what did you learn from last week during Angela's presentation? What was the things that stood out the most to you? Okay, so good stuff here. You learned a lot about ineffective study habits. You learned about kind of how to change those ineffective study habits. Great. Ways to retrieve information. Awesome. Okay. My second question is, what are you still, I guess, what is your expectation for today? What would you like to get out of today's presentation the most?
Yeah, I would say I really would like because I've taken like practice courses before, like U of M. It was like totally online or what have you, and I signed up for another program that was recommended. And following that, it didn't seem as though some of the questions or the training was in line with, I guess, what the actual exam questions are going to be like.
Okay.
And the only way that was confirmed is that there were other people who had taken it and said that they got totally different, like it was totally not what they expected, what they had been trained for. I haven't taken it before. So I just want to make sure that, those techniques are, or the questions or what have you will be the same, kind of like similar, because I know we don't have the exact ones. So that would be something for me.
Right. And Dr. Johns, I wanted to check with you. I think later in the week, I saw on the schedule, in the upcoming weeks, there will be some discussion more focused on the exam questions. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. Hi, Erica.
Hey, Chantalia.
Okay, I'm not going to turn this into a reunion, but
Right.
But yes, so we're laying the foundation. So we essentially broke up the 10 weeks into different parts that we thought were important for you all. So our first 4 sessions are really just laying the foundation in terms of how do you even approach a high stakes exam? What are some ways in which you can study for them? How to manage anxiety around taking a high stakes exam. So we really wanted to lay the foundation first. And then the second 4 weeks is where faculty in the School of Social Work are coming to talk about the actual content areas for each section of the exam, like the ethics, assessment, and the other ones. But yeah, so we got you covered. And then at the end, so the 9th and 10th week is where we're going to encourage you all to form study groups so that you can continue your learning. So that's, hopefully that answers your question, but that's sort of how we got it set up. And it's based on folks who have taken the exam in the school. So we kind of, okay, what are some things we wish we would have known? Like I personally studied probably way more than I needed to study. So having those effective study strategies, and I think someone put in there, which is my favorite thing, is small, frequent review. So having that knowledge is important. And that's why we're starting off our session like this, but not to where we'll get to the actual content area soon.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully that will cover your questions too in the upcoming weeks, just to make sure what you're studying. Yeah, is it like the actual exam. And I know that's something that when I was studying for my licensing exam, the counseling is like, I'm studying this material, but do I know if it's actually going to be like that? And, you know, definitely that's a concern, I think, with students who are taking any type of standardized exam. Yeah, so that I'm glad that you brought that up, Erica. So it looks like from the chat, a lot of students here are also wanting to look at scheduling study strategies. So I think that some of, yeah, what I already have here is in line with what you'd like to talk about. So we'll move forward. The first thing I'd like to talk about is creating a study schedule. And I know that can be challenging, especially if you have other responsibilities. I'm sure most of you aren't going to be just studying for this exam. So how do you balance all of that? And then kind of talking a little bit more in depth about some study tips, some examples that I have, and then leaving it for discussion and question and answer. All right, so I have another question to keep this interactive, because I think that you all have some great tips, and this is an opportunity, I think, for us to learn from each other. But my first question here is, what tips have you used? What have you done in the past to create a study schedule? Like what has been your method before? And so you can think about, you know, what worked, what didn't work when you've studied for exams before.
Well, if anybody else wants to go, because I don't want to just be answered, because I participate a lot, so I don't want to just be the only one. But for me, like school, and then graduating with honors and everything, it's different because, like, kind of just reviewing, reading, and then just reviewing and kind of committing it to memory, understanding what I'm doing. Like, I didn't really have a challenge with exams per se, but the timed ones was where the challenge came in for me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think. And even when we had like the older practice at the school social work and the computer lab, I remember like I ran out of time. So I think like for me, I always kind of go over it, or not want to say overthink it, but you know, I learned to, okay, put down the best answer. If it's something that I'm getting stumped on, you know, leave that, go to the next one, and then come back. And I don't necessarily know. I know you can do that with the LMS, you know, the MSW exam or whatever that we're preparing for, I believe. But I'm just fearing running out of time. You know, so I do well when I'm not pressured under time,
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like that. So that's for me.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. That is a very good point to bring up too. I can relate to that as well, and I'm sure many other students can. If you can, you know, raise your hand just so we know we're not alone here. But I think with standardized tests, or really with any exams, it's like an endurance test. So I believe that this exam is 4 hours in length that you have to do that. And so that is something I suggest to kind of simulate the exam environment as much as possible when you're studying. So that alleviates so much test stress. And so, of course, you all know that stress is an everyday part of our lives. Some stress can be motivating, can be beneficial, but when we have too much stress, that can really interfere with our ability to retrieve the information that we learned. So the more that you practice under the conditions of the exam, the easier it will be once you actually get to the exam. So it seems like you all have a lot of study material. I don't want to make any assumptions, but would it be safe to say that you have practice exams that you can take? So even if it's not a full length practice exam, yes, and I'm seeing in the chat here, there's practice exams. In your study schedule that you create, to block off time to take an exam full length. So you might not start right and jump into the 4-hour exam. You might start off doing an hour at a time. And then maybe the next week you do 2 hours and then 3 hours, so you get used to it. So that's my biggest piece of advice, to get comfortable with the time limit. And so I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but I think that I want to make sure that this is said. With any type of standardized test, this is the advice that I give to students too. When you're taking the exam, because it's very different if you have practice questions and you're doing the question and then you're looking at the answer. You're doing the question, looking at the answer. I see a lot of students do that, but it's just a very different type of environment. When you're taking the exam, you have 4 hours, you have over 100 questions. And it's like, how are you going to, there's going to be a different reaction that you might have. It might be, so part of simulating is also kind of being able to, hey, leave those questions that you aren't very sure of behind and kind of be able to move forward. It just allows you to be able to make sure that you are able to kind of be prepared for any type of situation. So I'm not sure if I'm articulating that right, but what I mean to say, it's just going to be a different environment when you're doing question by question versus a simulated test. So when you are simulating your test.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah,
so
sure.
If for clarity, you're saying that while we're doing the exam, or say we're doing a full practice 4-hour, when we get to a question, instead of overthinking it and spending a lot of time on that question, just move on and then we can come back. Is that what you're saying?
That's my advice. If you are, each question is worth the same, I'm assuming. So again, if you are, the goal is to get a certain amount of questions correct, staying stuck on one question really going to be worth your while. So
okay.
Yeah. And so again, it depends. It's not always one size fits all. And that's why I think really doing the practice exams and simulating the test environment will give you a feel for what works for you.
Okay, thank you.
I think that works for most students, but for others, they might not want to come back. It might be best to, give a little bit more time to one question. So that's kind of what I mean when I say like simulating the environment's different, because you have to take that into account. Whereas if you're just doing question by question and practicing, you're not going to run into that issue. So yeah, that's a great question. When you're taking the practice exam, I mean, definitely that is very important, but also what's really important too is making sure that you have the time set aside to analyze the exam. Okay, so I'm actually gonna stop sharing this and see if I can find another form I want to share with you. So what I suggest is having some sort of sheet that you create. And I'm going to see if I can send this so you have it, but I just want to show it to you. So you're analyzing each question and you're recognizing your patterns of, okay, did I get this question right? What was the topic? What type of a question was it? Was it clinical based? Was it kind of like a definition? Was it analytical? And really, this is I think this is really important for standardized exams. You're being tested on your analytical thinking skills, right? I mean, sure, there's knowledge that you have to know. You have to have a base of knowledge, but ultimately too, they're testing how you're thinking and how you're analyzing. So you want to make sure that you're doing that and testing yourself. So I'm going to share my screen here so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, can you see the screen okay? So I'll actually put this in the chat too, so you can have this. You might want to make some modifications, but the exam analysis, you're going to put however many questions you have. And then what is the top? Did you get it correct or did you get it wrong? What was the topic? What type of questions? So I have that blank. You can kind of determine, analytical, definition based. What are the type of questions that you all are being given if you had to categorize the question type? Do you have any idea about that? Or
Yeah, we have on policy, we have on diagnosis,
okay.
stuff like that we'll have to do. But I'm traveling right now. Is this going to be part? Is this form that you sent going to be part of the stuff that they send out? Because I'm not in a position to copy this right now.
Okay. Yeah, I can send that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, put it in
Yeah.
the chat. I put it in the chat too. It's a link.
Okay, thank you.
So this is what I suggest when you are, taking the exam, your practice exam, and then you might spend the next day doing the analyzing part. So you don't have to do it right after, because if you're taking a 4-hour practice exam, analyzing it might also take that 4 hours. So consider this study time. And what you're really doing here, the important thing is you're learning from quote unquote mistakes. You're looking at your patterns that you're like, so this is going to help you prioritize your time better. You can determine, okay, what are you more, not as comfortable with, what material, what do you know really well? So you can then focus more on the things that you need to brush up on. I'm not saying don't look at the things that you know well, but I think that students get caught in that trap of focusing on what they know more, because it's a bit more uncomfortable to study the things that we don't know as well. But again, part of what I want to emphasize, and I emphasize this to students, is part of the learning process is learning from mistakes. And there's a little bit of struggle, but if you can determine why you're getting questions wrong, or kind of like, it might even be in the miscellaneous, it might be, writing out how you feel. So some things like that might also be involved. It could be mental state, it could be feeling distracted. There's a lot of reasons. And this is what I have here too on the form. Part of the form is, this is just a post-exam reflection. And so you might kind of take some time to consider, how did you feel while you were preparing? Were your personal needs being met? What was going on kind of before the exam? And so these are just some reflective questions. Yeah. What did you learn from the experience? Yeah, so hopefully that will be helpful for you. And like I said, you might modify it. This is just an example. You can create your own. And I really suggest maybe modifying it to best suit your needs. Canva is free if you haven't used it. And I think that that's really easy to create something. So let's move on here. So I have kind of I don't like to put too many words on my screen, but just so if you need to go back to it. And then I'm going to show you some examples here too. So when creating a study schedule, I really suggest to students to have some sort of a weekly schedule so you can be consistent and have your study time set aside so it becomes a habit. So really protecting that time to the best of your ability. So that's really, I think, the important part. Motivation can be very fleeting, and sometimes it can be difficult to self-motivate, but if we create habits surrounding certain times or certain environments, it becomes a little bit easier to then meet our goals. So basically, in summary, associating a certain time and environment with studying on a weekly basis, if possible. So creating a schedule, even before that, is number one, I suggest to students is just to sit down and create a list of what you need to know on the exam. So it looks like you have probably a list, you know what categories will be on your exam, and it could be very broad. So I'm kind of going back to what I used to study for the counseling licensing exam. And so based on your study tools, it's going to be different. But I know here there's a table of contents and we have the different topics. So for example, there's social and cultural diversity, counseling and helping relationships, group work, career theories. And so I have the main topics, and then you may go even further and consider what are the subtopics. So you have a very comprehensive list of what will be on the exam. So kind of creating a study guide if you don't already have one. If you're being given one, I say use that. So the second one is prioritize the list. So how well do you know the material? So kind of like we were just talking about, you want to focus on prioritizing what you don't know as well, because you might need a bit more time to review that material. Thirdly, determine how many days you have to study. So you may have a lot of days. So I'm curious, is the licensing exam, is this offered throughout the year, or is it only offered at certain times of the year?
Throughout the year, you can, but if you take it and you don't pass it, like you have to wait like 90 days, but it's offered like year round.
Okay, so you can kind of modify based on how many days you have to study, and you might not go by days if you're going to take it in 6 months. You might go by weeks or by months, something like that. You want to chunk your topics based on how much time you have. And I'm going to show you an example. I'm just giving you an overview. Make sure that you build in time for review and practice tests. So like we were talking about, you might have time set aside as you get closer to the test date to take more practice exams. Something with practice exams, I suggest if you are able to take a practice exam towards the beginning of your studying, just to get an idea of, the test questions, simulating the test environment, and not expecting, it's not really about, okay, this doesn't determine how well you're going to do. None of the practice exams are really going to do that. It's just, again, part of the learning process, getting used to taking the standardized exam. So kind of looking at it as a marathon, right? You were training to run a marathon. You're not going to just, practice the day before and, do a practice marathon the day before and then do the marathon the next day, right? So kind of think about, you want to pace yourself in getting used to being able to sit down for 4 hours and go through over 100 questions. So that's really, I think, the big thing with studying for these types of exams is you've graduated, you know this material. It's just a matter of, okay, are you able to sit through 4 hours and do that? So really building in time for review and practice tests is going to be important, even from the beginning. So you don't have to start out with 4 hours. You can start at least maybe with 1 hour, but kind of throughout your studying. One last thing I'll say about that is you kind of have to know yourself here too, but I really kind of the week before the exam, or at least the day before, I don't recommend for students to take a full-length practice exam. Sometimes if a student doesn't do as well as they would like, sometimes that can really that can interfere with their mindset going into the exam. So if that will affect you, I suggest maybe, stopping any full-length practice exams at least a few days before your actual exam. I know Angela touched on this, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but a lot of you mentioned in the chat, or some of you mentioned the importance of review. And so I will say with any type of practice exam or any type of exam, the review is very important because it's going to keep your retention of the material high, okay? So I don't know if this was talked about. I can't remember. Ebbinghaus's curve of forgetting. So this is basically the short frequent reviews. I like to talk a little bit about the why behind things, because I think that when we know the why as students, we're more inclined to actually put that technique into practice. I'll go through this a little bit quicker, but essentially this curve of forgetting is goes over how material or information depreciates from our minds over time, okay? So these numbers are a rule of thumb. Don't really take that to heart. Ebbinghaus did this research over 100 years ago, and so times are definitely different. So material or information might depreciate at different rates. It also depends on the person. But this example is for if you're in class. But what I'll just say without going too much into this is when you're learning material, you're going through the actual content throughout your training here, is at least within 24 hours, if you can do something with that material in an active way to review it, that's really going to help your retention. It's going to help you retain the information at a higher rate, so you don't have to go back and relearn it. Okay, so relearning isn't necessarily a terrible thing, but it can be difficult when you have a lot of other responsibilities. So for example, if in your, so consider this when you're creating your study schedule. If, on day one, you want to study a certain topic, then maybe within the next day, next 24 hours, do something to review that, to make sure that you actually know the material. Okay, so how do you know that you know it? Can you test yourself? Can you talk about this material from memory? Can you summarize it in your own words? So kind of going back to some of the things you learned last week. You might do some practice questions on that material, okay? And that is really going to help you solidify that material in your memory, okay? So at least within 24 hours of really learning it, you want to review it. And then if you have some time during that week, like on the weekend, within 1 week, reviewing that material. And I'm not saying, so sometimes when I say that, students say review, like, that could take hours. It doesn't have to take hours. It could just be, again, doing some practice problems on those topics. It could be writing out in your own words a paragraph on each topic. What are the things that you tend to forget about that material? Things like that. So it's kind of, I think, a rule of thumb within 24 hours, and then at least 1 week later. But I think, as you're done and you're going through all of the content, it will all be review. So kind of consider that when you're creating your schedule. All right, so on to the next page. This is an example of kind of putting those points into practice. And this example is for students in a different topic. So it's for a final exam, but I think that this can apply. So again, you're going to have to modify it. But as we mentioned on the previous slide, the first thing you want to do is just have a list of what you need to know. Okay, so what are you working with? This student wrote out all of the topics that she needed to study for her final exam. The second thing she did was prioritize. How well does she know this material? You can prioritize in many different ways. You can write, like you can do the ABC method. This student, what they did was they ranked the material 1 through 4. 1 means they don't know the material very well. A 4 means that they can teach it to someone. They're very comfortable with this material, okay? So this is important because then you can group the material and chunk it, okay? So this is a suggestion with the prioritization. Again, you have to be flexible with what's going to work with you. This is a suggestion. This student wanted to mix up all of the material, so it wasn't necessarily from the same topics. If you want to chunk the material as you're creating your study schedule into a more broad topic, you can do that too. Okay, so this is just an example. The next item in creating a schedule is to chunk the material. So this is kind of difficult to see here. I apologize, the screen's maybe not as large. But what this student did was based on how much time they had to study, say they wanted to give themselves 9 days to really study the material, and the rest of the days that they were going to do some practice questions. I say for a standardized exam, still putting in time for practice exams, but this is more so to chunk the content, okay? So, for example, chunk number 1, these are the topics that the student is going to go through. And so each chunk number 1, she's starting out with the material she doesn't know as well first. And then by the time you get to chunk 9, that's material that she's a lot more comfortable with. So she's going to be reviewing throughout her study period, but the reason why she's starting off with the things she doesn't know as well is because she's going to be studying that more frequently. Okay. Any questions about this, like the chunking part? Okay. So again, I'm not suggesting just you have a lot more material, so you might have a lot more chunks. Okay. All right, and the next one is, oops, sorry about that. And then it's actually creating your schedule, okay? So you can do it one of 2 ways. What this student did is they actually had maybe each week for them was very different. So they wrote out what topics, what chunks they wanted to focus on. And they also wrote out what are some of the things that they have to prioritize in their life as well, aside from studying. So you can see here, it's a little hard to see, but on Monday, they're going to prep for chunk 1. So prep meaning they're going to focus on learning that material. And then Tuesday, they're going to review what they learned from chunk 1, and then maybe focus on material from chunk 2, okay? And then so on and so forth. So again, this is one example. You might not be able to study every single day, and that's okay. You might want to kind of have more gaps in the days that you study. based on what your priorities are. So this is just an example. You kind of have to determine what's going to work well for you. These are just the steps. Okay. What I suggest, I think that's a little bit easier, is having that weekly schedule, and you don't necessarily have what you're going to study within this schedule, okay? This is creating the habit of studying at a certain time every day of the week, or whenever you're going to study. This example here, I've worked with students on a lot that are taking a lot of different types of standardized exams. So this example here is a student who is in the physical therapy program. And so how they're prepping for their board exam. Again, yours might look different. So having a weekly schedule, if you're able to have some consistency, would be helpful. If your week varies week to week, you might then just create a plan at the start of every week. Okay, that might be best for you. But I suggest planning or having at least time set aside at the beginning of each week, or on a daily basis of focusing on what you're going to do for that week. I think that's one of the biggest suggestions for creating a schedule is planning time to plan, and also reflecting on, how your studying is going. So taking that time to reflect and change course if needed. So I'll kind of go over how this idea is set up, and I'll stop for questions. But when creating a weekly schedule, the first thing you want to fill in are any priorities that you can't really change. Okay. So this student, for them, their priority they couldn't change is they're in class. So they're in their clinicals all day, Monday through Friday, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So they blocked that time off. They can't study during that time in the way that they want to. That's time they can't be flexible. Whatever other priorities you have that are inflexible, write those down first on your weekly schedule. The second thing, and this is my suggestion, is to block off time to study. And so when you're doing that, you want to consider, when are you the most, alert? What is your environment going to be like? I think is also very important. Do you have a place where you're going to be able to focus and really dedicate that time to studying? Those are some things to consider when you're putting your study time in. I also I think having students or anyone prepping for an exam kind of look at that time that you set aside for studying as though it is time that you're working. So for example, if you have down in your schedule that you're working, say you're meeting with clients, you have some psychotherapy clients from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock. If you want to do something different instead, like go out to dinner, or something else comes up, you can't really do that because you have a commitment to meet with those clients, right? So kind of in the same way, as much as you can, protecting that time that you set down to study, as though it's actual kind of work time, I think helps students with being consistent. So this example here, the student wrote down their study time is in the hunter green color. And so they don't have much time during the week. What they're going to do is they're going to exercise first. They have time to set out to exercise because they find that really helps motivate them. And then they're going to study for 2 hours after that every night. And what they plan on doing is Saturday, they take a full-length practice exam. or they're doing practice questions, and then Sunday they're taking time to review that. So doing an analysis of their practice. You know, throughout the week too, there's content that they're studying, but they're also going to do some practice. It just might not be a full-length practice exam. So that's what works for their schedule. The third thing that they put down is what are their flexible responsibilities. So they put down grocery shopping, chores, meal prepping. They put down their travel time, sleep, definitely. And then lastly, they put down their free time. Their free time is in the maroon color. So for some students, they just write down their priorities and their study time, and they don't actually get to writing the other two. But I think if you want to be very flexible, at least writing out your priorities that you can't be flexible with in your study time will be really helpful. So then you have something set week to week where you're going to dedicate your time to studying for this licensing exam. More of kind of establishing a habit. What I suggest to students is to create their schedule and then just being able to be flexible if needed. So you might determine, hey, maybe you need more time. Maybe you need to have more frequent breaks, things like that. I know you touched on the Pomodoro technique in space practice before, so I'm not repeating that, but more so of how to structure your time. I think this is helpful. Okay. And so there's just a couple things I'm going to touch on here. And, you know, these are, I think really, I'm glad we spent some time on taking practice exams and really the practice questions, because I think that is really an important component of prepping for these standardized tests. But kind of like with studying your material, I'm not going to go too much in depth because Angela did talk about that, but really the things that I tell students to consider is how do you best organize the material in your mind? So you think about all of the information that you're going to be learning or that you've learned, but to come within the next few weeks. You know, if you don't have a method of organizing it, it's almost like, you know, studying a topic and then putting the paper in a file cabinet without any folders. So you know, input equals output, I think is what I mean when I say organizing. Is if you put the material in your mind when you're studying in an organized way, you're going to be able to retrieve that information a little bit easier. So how do you do that? Well, I like to organize material using mind maps, charts. Flashcards are also very helpful. This is a bit difficult to see here, but I just wanted to share this as kind of an example of how I studied when I took the licensing exam for counseling. Is statistics was one of the topics. And so this was the main topic, statistics, but then I had subtopics. So like there were t-tests and the different type of stats that we had to know. And then there were details within each subtopic. Okay. So this was how my brain organizes material a bit better. And to study this and see if I really knew it, I just took a subtopic. So maybe it was t-tests, and then determined, can I talk about t-tests? Can I talk about it as though I was teaching it to someone else? Can I do some practice questions on this topic? Can I recreate this mind map or part of it from memory without looking? Okay, so this is kind of a helpful way that I organize material. This doesn't work for every student. If you organize material, and I'm sorry, I couldn't find a good example for relating to social work. This is biology, but you can see here that this material is in a chart form, and it's going to be a lot easier to organize rather than if you had a bunch of words on a piece of paper. So a lot of exam questions, even standardized, are going to be comparing and contrasting different topics, content. And so if you can create some sort of chart with material that, you know, fits in with that, then to study it, you can test yourself by asking questions like, what's the difference between these two topics? So in this chart, what's the difference between a carbohydrate and a protein based on their function, based on, you know, what is the difference in their element? Another way to study, I can recreate this from memory. So, you know, this is really just an example of how you would best be able to retrieve it. So I think that creating some sort of chart, some sort of mind map is helpful. And again, it's not that you have to do this. If you find that how you're creating your notes is a way that you can easily retrieve material, then kind of stick with that. But that's kind of the major thing I wanted to point out was how you're putting information into your brain, how you want to be able to retrieve it. But yeah, I wish you all the best. And this is just wonderful. What the social work program is doing to help students with this licensing exam. Very impressed with all of this great material. So, you know, best wishes to you as you study, and you know, there's support here. So, you know, reach out and keep asking questions.